Hi, good morning everybody. Congratulations on getting up early again. So in Albuquerque last year, I gave an overview of the SpiNNaker project. My talk today is entitled SpiNNaker Update. I'm going to give a quick overview, repeating some of what I said last year for those here who weren't in Albuquerque last year. But then I'm going to talk a little bit about an application of the SpiNNaker system that has some interesting features. So firstly, just to acknowledge the sponsors of the work, the construction of the SpiNNaker system has been funded by the UK Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, EPSRC, and we have ongoing support through the European Union Human Brain Project and the European Research Council, and the logos of various collaborators and industry partners are also shown on this slide. And I'd like to acknowledge their support. Okay, so SpiNNaker, where does it come from? Well, when we put the first proposal in to work on SpiNNaker, which was around 2005, we put two headline questions up that we wanted to answer. And my sense is that these questions have quite a strong convergence with the theme of this workshop. In fact, they have quite a strong convergence with the basic themes of the Human Brain Project. So we found slotting into HBP a very natural thing to do. The first question is, the information processing in the brain remains a mystery to science, but computers are getting more and more powerful. Can we use the kind of computing power which is available today to accelerate our understanding of brain function? Obviously, this would be a collaboration with neuroscientists and psychologists and others with similar interests. And then secondly, because basically we're computer engineers, can we use what we learn about the brain to work out how to build better computers, whatever that means, more efficient, fault tolerant, and so on? Because everybody in here who's a computer engineer knows that the progress in Moore's law is bringing with it a set of problems to which we don't have ready-made solutions, but to which nature appears already to have discovered some solutions, if only we understood better how they worked. So these two questions resolved into this thing called the SpiNNaker project. SpiNNaker is a sort of contraction of spiking neural network architecture, suggesting a machine that's inspired by what we do know about the internal workings of the brain. And our goal from the outset has been to put 1 million mobile phone processors into a computer for brain modeling applications. We worked out at the beginning, even with 1 million mobile phone processors, we'd only get to about 1% of the scale of the human brain, and of course running very simplified models. So we're still a long way off whole brain modeling. But if you prefer, you can think of that as 10 whole mice brains. We heard yesterday that they're about 1,000 times smaller, and therefore my numbers from 10 years ago still look about right. And one obvious question is what's magic about 1 million processors? Well, the answer from an engineering perspective is that it's a big enough number that you have to worry about scalability from the outset. Scalability can't come as an afterthought. And then you might say, well, why only 1 million? And the answer there is fairly simple. We're trying to build this on an academic research budget, and there are limits to what you can get away with in academic research. So we focused on this 1 million because it's a nice big round number. Now, to build a machine, you have to have principles that guide your design decisions. I used to work in designing asynchronous chips in the 90s, and asynchronous chips, it's really hard to get people in the wider world interested, but as soon as you start talking about brains, then everybody pays attention. And one benefit of this is we had a very nice article in The Economist in 2015, and The Economist employs great cartoonists. So this is The Economist cartoonist, his perspective of neural engineering. It's pretty accurate, I think. He's got the classic engineer hanging out tongue posture right. I think we do that a lot. And, You know, the idea that if it doesn't work at first, what you need is a bigger hammer, that's fundamental engineering. Anyway, so the design principles were, firstly, we were aware that in the brain there are very diverse network structures in different brain regions, and we didn't want to have to rewire a machine every time we wanted to model a different region, and so we did the standard computer science thing of virtualizing the topology. So the machine has a particular topology, it's a 2D mesh, but you can map any neural topology onto the machine, and we provide the technology for doing that. Secondly, it's a massively parallel machine, and the thing that kills parallel computation is synchronization, so we don't do it. The machine supports a model of computation known as bounded asynchrony. Basically, each of the million processes in the system keeps its own view of real time. Things happen when they happen, and the processor's job is just to cope with whatever happens when it happens. And so in the machine, which from the outset we've had this goal of building it to run in biological real time, so at the same speed as biology, we have the simple concept that time models itself. And thirdly, it's a more engineering orientation, but this is a big machine. Big machines tend to burn power, and therefore the machine has been engineered to be as frugal with its use of energy as possible. My view of computing is that processors are free, at least if you buy them from the right source, and the real cost of computation is energy, right? And this is increasingly true right the way from mobile phones to supercomputers, that energy is the primary consideration. The silicon's relatively cheap in comparison. So I guess most people kind of know what SpiNNaker looks like. I've already said it's a 2D mesh. Each node in the mesh has 2 chips in it, one that we designed and a standard memory chip, and then these are coupled in a mesh which here I've drawn as a square mesh, but actually it's more symmetrical if you draw it as a hexagonal or triangular mesh. And each node is one of these SpiNNaker packages. The chip itself has 18 ARM cores on. Again, this is a number, Y18. Well, you know, it's the number that fits on a piece of silicon that's reasonably economic to manufacture. We fold it inside the package with the memory die. So it's a single package with 2 chips in, sort of 2.5D packaging. It's simply connected using gold wire bonding, so there's no complicated through silicon vias or anything, it's just wire bonded internally. But then this is molded together into the attractive plastic package with the sale logo linking to the name. And you know, we spent the first 5 years of the project just designing this square centimeter. That took about 40 man-years of effort. One of my claims for chip design is you get more PhDs to the square millimeter than in most subjects, which is obviously an important research quality metric. If we look inside the chip a bit more closely, the key features are highlighted here. So the processors are pretty simple, ARM9, they're ARM968 cores, they're a 20-year-old design now, but really they're quite energy efficient on the scale of the range of ARM cores that are available. Their performance is modest, but that's okay. And they are in the light blue rectangle to the right side, just above the middle. And in SpiNNaker, the neural models and the synapse models are in software. Okay, so we decided early on that the neuroscience community did not have a strong consensus as to what the correct neural model was or what the correct plasticity rule was. And we decided the way to handle that uncertainty was to use software. So if you have a new neural model, you can code a little bit of real-time ARM code, and then you can have that model running on 1 million cores on SpiNNaker very easily. Energy efficiency is about data movement. So above that little blue rectangle, there are the green rectangles where the local memories reside. Each processor has 32 kilobytes of code space, instruction memory. and 64 kilobytes of data. These numbers are fairly carefully constructed. They're small. This machine is not going to run Windows anytime soon. And you know, when the typical modern day student comes in and says, what can you possibly do with 32 kilobytes of code space? Then all I have to do is get out my trusty BBC Micro from the 1980s, show them David Braben's Elite program, which ran in the 12K below the graphics area. And that was a 3D color graphic intergalactic space transport game that ran in 12K. And so I said, that's what you can do in much less than 32 kilobytes. So learn from that. But the key thing here is that those memories are about a millimeter away from the processor. And the most frequently used data is a millimeter away. If you want a simple model of the energy required to perform a computation, it's the number of bits you have to move multiplied by the distance they move. So keeping distance small is the first priority. The less frequently used data, which in SpiNNaker is the much larger structures required to describe synaptic connections, that's in the 128 megabyte DRAM, which is accessed through the orange port at the bottom left. So that's about 10 millimeters away. Up to this point, SpiNNaker is just a conventional, massively parallel computer. Okay, nothing interesting has happened yet. The only thing is we've built it out of mobile components rather than high-end processors. We've scaled everything down and kept it lightweight, but otherwise it's a conventional, massively parallel computer. The innovation in SpiNNaker is in the red bit in the middle, which is how we connect these processors together. And this is very much tuned to the problem that we're trying to address. Neural networks are usually modeled as static graphs. Occasionally, of course, if you want to model development or structural plasticity, you want some local rewiring. But the assumption in SpiNNaker is that the graph that describes the problem is either static or at most slowly changing. And we map the problem graph onto our mesh using routing tables. We convert every neural spike into its own packet, and then we simply propagate this packet around the system using a packet switch fabric. Again, fairly standard, but we've made it very lightweight. We use basically packet switched address event representation. So the packet tells you which neuron spiked. It doesn't tell you anything about where that information is required. That information is all contained in the routing tables. And because neural networks are very highly connected, we use a multicast routing system. So a single packet coming from a single core can end up at 100,000 other cores, and we can guarantee to do that in a small fraction of a millisecond to maintain the biological real time. So the key innovation in SpiNNaker is in the router. Now, the router is simple. I like simple. And so on the top left of this picture, you can see a typical packet. There's a 32-bit routing key. That's the address event representation code, the AER code. There's an 8-bit header, which does some housekeeping. And there's an optional payload. You can stick a 32-bit data payload on if you want, but typically for spiking networks, you don't. So typically, we use a 40-bit packet. And when the packet arrives at the router, that 32-bit key is compared with a set of entries in a ternary content addressable memory, the ternary CAM. The ternary bit means it has don't cares, so you can pattern match on any subset of the bits in that key. And if you find a match, then you can look up the route that packet should take in a straightforward RAM. And what you get out is a 24-bit vector, which has 1 bit for each of the 6 interchip links and 1 bit for each of the 18 local processors, and that packet can be directed to any or all of those, any subset of those. And that allows us to support routing as shown to the right here, where there are a couple of example routes. If you take the red node at address 1.1, again, this is drawn square because it makes seeing the address space easier. Although it's more symmetric if you skew it all and make it triangular. But the node 1.1, which is colored red towards the bottom, wants to send a spike to the 3 yellow nodes at 6.3, 7.3, and 6.4. I don't know if this is readable from where you are. Anyway, it's the 3 yellow nodes together at the right. And basically that requires a table entry at the source, a table entry at the white node 4.1 to turn the packet in a different direction, and then table entries at the yellow target nodes. And because typical neural models route spikes by population rather than by individual neuron, the ternary nature of the CAM means that you can route all the packets in a population in that first red node to all the populations in the yellow nodes with single table entries at those 3 points. Now, clearly with a 32-bit key, a full table would need to be 4 gigabytes, or no, 4 giga entries, and that is infeasible, even on today's technology. So one of the design questions is, how big should the table be? And the answer is, the table has 1,024 entries. Is this the right answer? Well, we don't yet know. It's turning out to be good for quite a lot of problems, a bit of a constraint for some others. But it's one of the parameters where, in engineering terms, you've kind of got to put your finger in the air and take a guess on something. Now, because we don't expect the target user community for SpiNNaker, which is primarily the computational neuroscience community, to want to worry about how they configure routing tables and how they write real-time code to run on ARM cores, we have a stack of software which does most of the work for you. So we accept a network description in a standard description language. Our primary support, as Karl-Heinz said yesterday, is for Pine, which is a Python-based neural network description language. But we also have a front-end support for Nengo, which is Chris Eliath's language from Waterloo. We can feed in a description in those languages, and then basically our tools grind those things down, work out how to map the problem onto the machine, and generate the various binary files needed to execute the model. And so the binary image is constructed, and then that's loaded onto the machine. Now, as Thomas Nowotny quite rightly pointed out yesterday, these data structures can be quite big, and loading them onto the machine can therefore be quite slow. We have some plans to address this. One of the things we're planning to do is to do some of the generation of particularly the large synaptic weight structures actually on the machine rather than off the machine, so that all we have to load is a relatively small description, and then we'll expand that on the machine. But that's a solution which is close but yet to come. So basically, if you can describe your network in Pine and you don't use too many of the exotic features of Pine because we can't support the complete language yet, then the tools will simply map it onto the machine and it will run. The execution model on the machine, again, is driven by our desire to keep the energy consumption down. So the natural state of any core on the machine is asleep in a low power mode, and it's then event driven. So if the code for the machine is expressed in a number of event handlers, when an event happens, the core wakes up, does something, and goes back to sleep again. And the 3 typical things that happen are shown here. A packet arrives. This can happen any time, from any place. The core wakes up, puts the packet in a buffer, and goes back to sleep. There's a dequeuing system that uses a DMA engine to transfer data from the large SDRAM into the local memory. And that DMA generates an event when it completes. That wakes the processor up to do the synaptic processing. And then there's also a local time reference, which is typically a 1 millisecond timer tick, and this wakes the processor up to drive the ODE solvers forward another time step. And of course, these events can happen at any time and in any order, and so there's a small real-time operating system sitting underneath this that allows these things to happen completely asynchronously and to resolve and to get the processor back to sleep as soon as possible. In terms of where we can get to, our goal has been to go for 1 million cores supporting 1 billion neurons. And the scalability numbers are here. We can model up to 1,000 neurons per core. Our current software is running at about a quarter of that. We still have some work to do on the mapping efficiency. We have 18 cores per chip, 48 chips on a big board, 24 boards in a card frame, 5 card frames in a 19-inch cabinet, and 10 19-inch cabinets, and we're there, okay? Easy. It does take a long time to assemble it. We have been building machines for several years. The small board, shown as 102, and Karl-Heinz was quite right. What this numbering indicates is the 102 machine has 10 to the 2 cores, approximately. It actually has 72. And that's enough to model a network of the scale of a pond snail. Now, in order to avoid really annoying my neuroscience colleagues, I point out this is the scale of network. It doesn't mean we can model a pond snail brain, because there's lots of details that we don't capture and lots of details that are possibly unknown. Similarly, the 48-node board with 864 cores can model a network of about the scale of a small insect, a few 100,000 neurons. Put 25 cards in a card frame and you're at 20,000 cores and frog scale, and then we can put 100,000 cores in a single 19-inch cabinet, and that gets us to about mouse scale. You know, again, all these animal references are to indicate scale. They all come with a health warning. Otherwise, I get very badly told off by the neuroscientists. And you saw this picture yesterday, I think at least twice. We have now assembled the 5 racks of SpiNNaker boards. This is 500,000 cores, and this is our commitment to the Human Brain Project, is to put a 500,000 core machine online and make it openly accessible for anybody to use. So this machine is up and running. Later this month, we have a workshop on the 22nd. I think the official launch has now moved back to March the 30th. But from the end of this month, anybody who wants access to this machine will be able to get it remotely over the internet. Now, I have no idea what anybody is going to do with 500,000 cores. One model that we're working on quite actively with Chris Eliasmith is his spawn model. His spawn model takes a few percent of this machine, okay? We expect to have his spawn model running in real time. Currently, his spawn model runs on quite a high-end desktop and takes 2.5 to 3 hours for each second of real time. So that represents about a 10,000 times speed up. So what we're trying to do here is basically remove the scale barrier to the size of network that computational neuroscientists want to think about, and then see if that causes anything interesting to happen. We will be trying to cause interesting things to happen ourselves at the same time, but we're very interested in finding users who have appropriate challenges for this machine. Now, that's an overview of the machine. What I said I'd do is say something about applications, and what I've decided to talk about, because I think it's quite interesting, is actually a small job I did myself. Okay, it's always dangerous when the prof starts trying to use the technology. This makes the students very nervous. But I did this here, and this was basically building a network that solves Sudoku. It's very much inspired by work done by Wolfgang Mass's group earlier, where they built a stochastic network that would solve hard Sudoku problems. And one of my students picked up on this and mapped that network onto SpiNNaker and got it running. But then he interrupted and work stopped on it. And I thought this was a nice thing to talk about, so I decided to pick it up and play with it myself. But I adopted a slightly different approach, which I'm going to tell you about. Does everybody in the room know the rules of Sudoku? I tried this in China last November and got a completely blank response. Nobody in the room had heard of Sudoku. I guess that's not the problem here. Anyway, the quick reminder is Sudoku is a puzzle on a 9 by 9 grid, and you're usually given numbers in a subset of that grid, and the puzzle is to find numbers to fit in all the other squares, and the constraints are that you can't use the same digit between 1 and 9 twice in a row, in a column, or in one of the 3 by 3 subsquares. So that's the constraint. You've just got to find a pattern such as the one you see here, where the same digit does not occur twice in any row, column, or square. Now, I set about trying to describe a network to solve this from first principles. And I wanted to do this just using our standard tool flow. So I didn't want to do anything difficult. And so I decided that looking at the balance on SpiNNaker, a sensible approach was to use one neural population per cell, that population comprising 9 subpopulations, each of 25 standard neuron types, integrating fire with current exponential synapses. So 225 neurons describing the 9 possibilities in each cell. And because, again, from Wolfgang Mass's example of solving this, you wanted a noisy network, and on SpiNNaker, the easy way to add noise to the system is to simply couple a Poisson noise source, and that's another type of neuron. So for each of the standard neurons, you have a matching Poisson neuron that just generates noise. So that gives you a total of 81 cells times 225 times 2, 36,500 neurons. Okay? Pick a number. Sometimes, not always, but I'll come to that, you apply some initial values, and I did this by simply connecting Poisson spike source populations in reasonable numbers to the cells to drive the digit I wanted to initialize the cell to. And if you look at the connections there, you get about 21,000 synapses. Then the interesting bit, which are the constraints. Now, in a sense, of course, Sudoku is not a terribly interesting problem because you can get an app for your smartphone, you can just point the camera to Sudoku problem and it'll give you the answer. But it is quite a complex constraint problem. I've been told it's quite similar to the traveling salesman. I haven't quite worked out how to map the traveling salesman into a similar format, but so it's quite a complex constraint problem. The nice thing about Sudoku is you get visual results. Okay, so it's very easy to see what's happening. And the way I implemented the network is I simply put inhibitory connections from each digit to all the other digits within a cell. So if the cell wants to be a 5, it can't be a 4 or a 3. And that's represented by inhibitory connections within a cell. And that gives you 3.5 million synapses in the model I've described. And then likewise, to constrain, if you have a digit in one cell in a row, it inhibits the same digit in all the other cells, and likewise in the column and in the square. And that rapidly clocks up another 9 million synapses. And so we have a model here that's got something like 13 million synapses. It can all be described very simply in Python. I admit to this being my first ever Python program. It's 165 lines to describe this in Pine in a form that you can then just feed to the machine. Now, in trying to understand what the network does, Michael Hopkins suggested I should look at a measure of network resolution based on entropy. And so I'm going to show you graphs. So I'm just trying to explain what's coming up in terms of graphs fairly soon. So the network, as I've described it, runs. Basically, I log every spike in the network for 30 seconds and get a big spike file out, which I then analyze. And in the analysis, I estimate the probability of a particular digit in a particular cell by counting spikes across a time window, normalizing those counts across the cell to get the most likely digit, and then I accumulate that value over time with a small decay so that I can use a fairly small time window, but the noise is sort of smoothed out by accumulating the value. And then the current recommendation for the digit for that cell is just the digit with the highest probability, okay? That's fairly simple. Now, the entropy is basically summing over the entire matrix, the sum of minus p log to the base 2p, where p is the probability, and over all digits in all cells, and that gives you the entropy of the network. And that has quite an interesting behavior. The first sum you can do is you can say what's the maximum entropy this network can ever have. It's always good to scale your graphs. And of course, the entropy is maximized when the probability of each digit in each cell is equal, i.e. 1/9. And so you just work out 81 times 9 times minus p to the log base 2p, where p is a 9th. And the answer, interestingly, is the maximum entropy is just over 256 bits. And so you can see how that works. And I'm just going to show you a number of runs and talk about them. The coding I'm going to show you, where you see a digit is gray, that means it's an initial value, it's been stimulated externally, and it appears gray when it's correct. Because even when it's stimulated, the most likely value may not be that stimulated value. When it's shown as red, it's wrong. It's violating one of the constraints. When it's shown as green, the most probable number is consistent with the constraints. In other words, it doesn't clash with the same most probable digit in row, column, or square. And the other thing, which I'm not sure how well this will work on a projector, is that the brightness of the digit actually indicates the confidence of the network in the answer, the probability, okay? So that's what you're going to see, and you're going to see a set of things that look like this. This is a typical network where the initial values are not all placed on instantly at the start. They're placed on sequentially. This was a thought to try and solve an issue. I'm not sure it makes any difference. What you're seeing on this slide is the Sudoku puzzle, which you can see is now solved. Everything's either gray or green. If you look very closely, the green is getting brighter because the confidence in those results is increasing. On the top left, you're seeing the entropy plot, and the dots there are red when the solution is not correct, and they turn blue when it's correct. So what you can see is a very nice, smooth drop of entropy in the network. The solution emerges only about halfway down the curve. And then at the bottom right, I have to explain this. Again, I was interested in the sort of analogy between what I'm doing here and a simulated annealing algorithm. Now, in simulated annealing, as you converge on a solution, you generally reduce the noise to cause the system to settle more strongly. The interesting thing here is, as the noise reduces at the right-hand side, the entropy in the network starts to go up. I haven't yet run this far enough to know if you turn the noise off, if the thing will actually come out of a solution. The thing at the bottom left is a complete raster plot of all 81 cells over the entire run. It's something I got strangely good at reading, but probably needn't worry you with. And so this is an example where the puzzle gets solved, and there's only one parameter that's actually interesting in what I'm going to discuss. The whole network has got relatively few parameters, but this one up here is the noise parameter, which is controlling the degree of noise. All the parameters are selected from distributions and are a bit sort of random, but this is the sort of mean noise parameter. And so I thought, well, I wonder what this network does if I don't give it any initial state. What will it do? So I did that, and even when I turned the noise down from 1.6 to 1.1, the answer is nothing interesting happens. The entropy stays maxed out. The rasters show everything's firing all the time, and nothing emerges from the picture. So that wasn't very interesting. However, if you turn the noise down a little bit more, then something interesting does happen. So from going down from 1.1 to 1.0, there's no initial values here. It's just a network set up with the constraints. And what you see is the entropy sort of hangs around, but then suddenly starts going down. and a random Sudoku solution emerges. Okay, and it's a valid solution. It's all green, so there's no conflicts. And because it wasn't given any initial condition, I kind of, in rather loose language, described this as dreaming a solution. It's not been told anything. It just emerges. And I thought it was fairly likely that if this network was set up right, that, if it was given an initial condition, it would find a solution. If it wasn't given an initial condition, it would find a random solution. It turns out, well, as currently set up, that doesn't happen. Because if I take that same noise level, which you saw, well, you've only seen a couple of samples, but I just reduced the noise until it produced a stable solution without any initial conditions. So I thought, well, what happens if I put the initial conditions back in? And what happens here is the entropy goes down a long way, okay? So you get to really quite a low entropy, but a solution does not emerge. And effectively, the network is getting stuck in some kind of local minimum because there isn't enough noise for it to find its way to a valid solution. Now, this is all sort of fairly preliminary work, okay? I haven't drawn any conclusions from this yet. And I'm still thinking about what this all might mean. You can see in this failure, by the way, you can see the conflicts because the conflicting numbers are red. So you can see 3 6s over there with 2 conflicts and 4 7s with each with just a conflicted pair. So where are we up to? So the first thing I wanted to say is I did all this on the HBP portal. Okay, so this service that we're about to offer openly, we've been running internally for Human Brain Project members for, I think, about the last year. And that's all I used for this. Okay, you might think this is odd. I run the SpiNNaker group. My lab is full of hardware. But I was quite interested to see how difficult it was to do this kind of thing over the portal. And the answer is, at least in this case, it was extremely straightforward. It takes about 6 minutes to set once the job's set up on the queue, it returns the results in about 6 minutes for a 30-second run. So again, similar to what you heard from Thomas yesterday, there's a fairly big overhead. There's 5.5 minutes of doing something other than running the network, and that's something we hope to improve, but it's the current state. It generates about 50 megabytes of spike data, which is what I copy back for analysis. I do the analysis locally. The analysis is very quick. It has this mysterious property that you need higher noise to find a solution with inputs than you do to dream a solution without inputs. Now, my thought on this is that one has to be slightly careful because the noise here is actually not unbiased noise, okay? Because the Poisson sources are all firing into excitatory inputs, the DC is not 0. So they're actually adding DC bias to the network as well as stochastic noise. And that may be part of the reason why we see this difference. And this phenomenon that the network entropy increases if you reduce the noise that you supply to it is something I'm still thinking about. The kind of things I'm planning for the future, if I ever get any more seconds to work on it, is to think about how one might control the noise homeostatically so that you don't have to change the noise level for solving and dreaming. And as a big challenge, it seems to me possible that this network has the rules of Sudoku hardwired into it. Okay, so it knows Sudoku, those are the constraints. It's possible to think about how you build a network that would actually infer the rules by being shown examples. I think it's quite tricky because the current rules are embedded as inhibitory cross-connections. I think to learn the rules, you'd have to flip those over to excitatory connections, and that would be quite a weaker way to represent the constraints. But anyway, this is sort of work in progress. So I just wanted to show this as a kind of thing that's fairly easy. It's quite a big network. I believe one of my students has taken this network and tried to run it on Nest, which is standard desktop, and NES breaks because it exceeds some number. The number of connections exceeds some limit. But I've simply run this on SpiNNaker through the HPP portal with the standard toolset and never hit a problem. So I'm not sure this is a universal experience, but for this kind of model, which is it's relatively straightforward in terms of what it's built from, but it's fairly large. And you know, the 13 million connections, it's running on about 200 to 300 ARM cores. So it's only using a sort of handful of SpiNNaker chips. But even so, all the routing and connections have to work, and the traffic has to avoid congestion and so on. So I think we've got something that's beginning to be useful. So just to wrap up, the SpiNNaker machine itself has been 18 years in conception. I remember when the set of ideas that are now in the machine started and when they came together. They came together actually out here in the valley when I was visiting Sun Labs. We've been constructing it for 10 years, again the magic 10 years. All large-scale projects take 10 years apparently. But now we have the big machine, it's ready for action. We have got about 70 smaller boards out with groups around the world, so there are quite a lot of people tinkering with it. We've built machines up to the 500,000 core, and we're still planning to extend this. We're still planning to double that up to 1 million, and that 1 million core machine will still be available through the HPP portal. It's just that the 500,000 core machine is our contractual commitment to the European Commission. All right, so that's tick, done. The 1 million will come sort of at our leisure. We're very interested in finding large models because all the models are represented in code. The models don't have to be neural networks, okay? Something to think about is if you can break your problem down into a very large number of really quite simple processes interconnected by a reasonably static graphic topology, we can probably run it. So there are people interested in running, well, Andreas Andrew at Johns Hopkins has run Bayesian networks on it. People run factor graphs on it. All sort of related but non-neural models. Now our software support for that is not as extensive. But there are quite a lot of things you can do. And I'm very interested to see who can come up with models that use anything like 500,000 cores. 500 million neurons. Have you got your 500 million neuron model ready yet? The Human Brain Project is supporting the software development, and the open access will arrive this month. Now, the graph on the right is from the Human Brain Project proposal, and it's showing the sort of energy efficiency of different ways of brain modeling. The very biologically detailed models at the top running on a large supercomputer use about one joule per synaptic connection. The brain uses about 10 to the minus 14. SpiNNaker is about 10 to the minus 8 joules per synaptic connection. The analog neuromorphic system from Heidelberg is about 2 orders of magnitude better. True North, I think, is probably about the same level as that. It's certainly orders of magnitude better than SpiNNaker. But what you see in this stack are kind of trade-offs of energy efficiency versus flexibility. And I think with SpiNNaker we occupy quite a nice niche because we have a lot of flexibility we don't have the best energy efficiency, but we have a usefully good energy efficiency with a very high degree of programmability. So I shall stop there. Just notice that I didn't do this on my own. My team is not of the scale of the Allen Institute. But because the project's been running 10 years, waves of PhD students have come and gone. There's several PhDs on the chip. There are several PhDs in the software that came later, and various postdocs and group members. And I'd like to acknowledge the contributions of all of these people. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Steve. A couple Quick questions. You said that after every millisecond of ODE update, it goes back to sleep. But if you have neurons that have dynamic, kinetic equations that are solved by ODEs, I would think that all the neurons would need to update themselves every millisecond. So you couldn't go to sleep? Am I missing a piece?
Well, each core is constrained by the number of compute cycles it has in each millisecond, okay? And it will spend a certain number of those cycles computing ODEs. It'll spend a certain number of those cycles computing connections through synapses. If you fill it, you've got to provision for a kind of worst case when lots of spikes arrive at once. So in the typical case, you don't use all those cycles in any millisecond.
I see. So then you can shut it off for the balance of the millisecond.
Yeah. So typically, the ODE solving takes about 20% of the cycles in each millisecond, and the synapses take 80% if you're running a model with a 1 millisecond time step.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you turn it off during that millisecond if you finished updating all your ODEs.
Yeah.
And have spare. Second question, in your routing table, the 32-bit, and I followed more or less the hashing scheme. If you had neurons that were simulated in software on the target core with 100 dendritic branches, would your routing accommodate targeting the synapse to a particular branch of a great number? Or just, I wasn't clear how you sub-target once you get to the core.
The sub-targeting is done by the core itself. So in a typical simple model, a point neural model where we don't have any dendritic structure, but we have sparse connectivity, if you think of the weight matrix where the vertical axis is the number of different inputs and the horizontal axis is the number of different local neurons, we do a fairly simple row compression on that. If it's 10% connectivity, 90% of those values are 0. We don't represent those. We compress the rows. If you want to do something more subtle, and you probably want to do something to do with dendritic substructures, I don't think anybody's done that yet, but there are ways to do that. In fact, one of my students currently has a rather different way of mapping the problems onto SpiNNaker, which make dendritic models, independent dendrites, very straightforward. In principle, you can do it in software, but it's a real-time system, so you better keep your software simple.
Yeah, great. Okay, thanks very much.
Okay.
So I really enjoyed this. This is great. And most people should know here that this is I have no financial interest in this. This is a flash, 256 gigabytes.
Yeah.
It has about 500 ARM cores in it right now, all hierarchically arrayed. And an interesting thing would be to take the SpiNNaker architecture and impress it into standard memory units, which is available, today. So as long as Flash exists, which is only another couple, 3 or 4 years, okay, you will have all this unbelievable computation power in this thing, okay? Which is an interesting thing. So the other thing that I sort of disagree is I don't see this as a traveling salesman problem, the Sudoku thing, okay?
Yeah.
It may be NP complete. Is that what they said? Because it's not a correct analysis of. Anyway, that's another story. So anyway, so this is an interesting thing to think about. So I was chief technologist at Seagate, and I believe we have somebody here who's also another expert in this stuff. And think about putting SpiNNaker into little tiny boxes that don't require fans. Okay,
and of course that would go quite a long way to solving some of our I/O issues.
And I think it really will.
Because basically, you'd not only have the execution, the runtime memory local to the processor, you'd have the storage memory reasonably local as well.
So if you need some help talking to these idiots that do storage, okay, I can help.
Okay, thank you.
Two more questions. Thank you very much for a very enjoyable talk. A couple of questions. How many synaptic connections, maybe on average or total, do you get per neuron?
So the architecture is kind of aimed at neurons with 1,000 inputs, but it's not that's not a hard constraint. It's a kind of performance number we revolve around. In the Sudoku model, I think the number of connections per neuron is approaching that. It's 750 or something. Now, you can have many more. We're clearly aware that the typical biological systems, people aim for 10,000 rather than 1,000. All that you have to watch is the number of connections per second, because each connection requires a number of CPU cycles. Okay, so if your connection matrix is deeper, then it's going to be narrower. And there are some efficiency issues with making it too narrow. This new execution model I referred to actually addresses that in quite an interesting way, but that's not what's on the system at the moment.
And have you ever hit any limit? Like, have you ever run a problem where you've kind of run out of memory because you wanted to have more synapses, but you couldn't, or have you not really hit that limit? I'm not aware of that. We have hit different limits. Okay, so there's one of the models we're working with is quite a detailed cortical microcolumn model that developed at Jülich in Germany, and that has a very diffuse connectivity pattern. And our connectivity is efficient when you can do the connections collectively. But if the connections become very sparse, then it loses efficiency. Now, we have got that model up and running now, but it's actually taken quite a lot of work to work out how to do that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Steve. So my question related to the noise and noise control and the dream, that little part of the talk that you talk about. You use a Poisson noise. I was curious whether you have changed noise patterns, different kinds of noise, the Gaussian noise, and how would that impact to entropy as functional noise, that you have this rise near the end?
The answer is no, I haven't tried any other sort of noise source. I'm not sure we have a different noise source in the library. I mean, I can ask that question, but most of the models that people want seem to use Poisson noise.
Right. What would you think that it might change under noise control, so to speak?
I have no idea. I suspect Wolfgang could probably make a better guess at that than I can.
All right, we'll talk about that. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Steve.